If you're ready to start stitching the Birch Lane table runner, I'll show you some of the stitches used. Basically, they're very, very simple. One of them is just a whip stitch, very simple thing. And it says in the directions to use the whip stitch around the edge of the body and tail of the bird with the black thread. So I've already done it. You can't really see it because it's black on black, but I've already done it around the bird, and now I'm going to do it around the tail so you can see. And I like to take about 1/8 of an inch and then move over about 1/8 of an inch. So go in 1/8, over 1/8, so that my stitches are going straight into the applique piece. And this is a variegated thread, so now it's looking a little lighter. In some areas it's pretty black. If you're going to use a 6-strand floss instead of the 12-weight Baldani, I would suggest using 2 strands of floss. That's about the same weight as the 12-weight pearl cotton. So that's how simple the whip stitch is. I'm not worried too much about my back. It just will look kind of like this. If that's something that bothers you, you can always line it, or you can like thread your threads through some of the stitches, but they're so big it really might not hold it that well. So I would just recommend tying knots. Now we'll move on, since we've whip stitched the bird down, and another step that we want to take is to satin stitch his beak. So I'm using the same dark floss or thread, and I'm going to start at the widest point right up against his head and just go straight across. And the nice thing about doing a satin stitch over a fabric is it really forms a nice line for you to follow. And if your stitches aren't perfectly lined up, you only see the fabric underneath, so you don't see the white of the fabric or the light colored of the fabric. And this, like I said before, is a variegated thread, so his beak is going to be some different colors, different shades here as it goes down. If you're more comfortable using a hoop with this, you could do that. But I found that with the applique fabric, it keeps it nice and stiff, so you don't have to worry about, you know, the fabric gathering or puckering. So my stitches aren't perfect here, but it's hard to tell because of the black fabric underneath. And we'll just finish up with the point. And now the beak is done. With the beak done, we can start on the head, and the directions say to use a running stitch with this lighter colored thread. So what I like to do is start at the outside, and I'm going to keep it about 1/16 of an inch away from the edge of the fabric. I don't want to get too close because I don't want it to fray the edges, but this will help hold it in place, and you can even wash it. The one that I made previously, I washed it in the washing machine and hung it to dry, and just these little bit of stitching is all it takes to really hold it in place. I didn't have any problems at all. So you'll just go all the way around with a running stitch, which is just, I guess, like a quilting stitch up and down. And sometimes you can take more than one if you cheat. But going through several layers of fabric, sometimes it's easier to just do one stitch at a time. Oop, that was a crooked one. And if you haven't followed me before, you will notice I'm not one for perfection. I enjoy the process, and that's what's more important to me than getting every stitch just exactly right. So then I'm just going to step in a little bit and go around again. So it's just going to be a circle within a circle within a circle all the way around. So I'll go ahead and finish this head, and then we'll move on to the wing. So you can see the head is all stitched, so we're going to move on to the wing. And the wing is going to be done by fly stitches. So we're going to start in this corner right here. And actually, I'm going to turn my fabric this way. And I'm going to put the thread down about there, about 1/4 of an inch. And then I'm going to come up in the black. So it forms a little triangle there. Carry the thread under the needle, and that's the first stitch. Okay, now we're coming straight down the fabric, and we're going to the outside of the applique. And you've got this little V with a straight line. We're just going to repeat that. So I'm going to go across from where they came up here and down here, and then up at the end of that stitch. The thread goes under the needle, and that's the second one. And go down, kind of come back up at an angle here so that we can form that V again. And you just continue this all the way down. And you can see in the pattern, it's this one goes all the way, and then you just pop down here a little bit, go a little bit to the end there, and then do the final one there. That's the fun part of projects like this, is that they're all going to be just a little bit different. You can tell that they're handmade, they're not made by machine, which I think is what makes them more special. So I will finish up this bird wing, and then this bird will be finished, and we will move on to the leaves. Moving on to the leaves. If you're doing a dark leaf, then you'll want to use a light colored thread. And if you're doing a lighter colored leaf, then you want to use the dark thread, just so that there's some contrast there and you can see it. So the leaf is very simple. You're going to start at one end, and we're going to just stitch a straight line right up the center using a stem stitch. So for a stem stitch, I'm going to take about 1/8 of an inch. This might be a little bit bigger because it's thicker fabric to work through. So a little bigger than 1/8. Come back halfway in between there. And that's the first stitch. Now I had my thread on this side, so I'm going to continue to always have my thread on that side. You just want to be consistent. So I'm going to take 1/8, come back up in that same hole, and that's the second stitch. So stem stitch goes pretty fast. When I'm doing a lot of detailed work, I'll take really, really tiny stitches, especially if I'm going around a tight circle. But since this is more of a folk arty kind of look, and I'm stitching through some kind of heavy fabric, I'm taking bigger stitches. So once we get to the end, then we're going to come back and we're going to put in the angled veins of the leaf. And with those, just like when you were doing the wing of the bird, you want to go off the end of the applique into the fabric, even here where we end it, because we want that to be held in place. Now I'm going to come back up in the fabric, maybe 1/4 of an inch down, and then at an angle go back to the center stem, and that's the first vein. Now I'm going to take my needle up on the other side of that center stitch, come back up at an angle over the applique onto the background fabric, and I'm just going to continue that all the way down the leaf. And if you're having trouble keeping your angles kind of consistent, what I like to do is put my needle on that stitch and then move it down, and then I can see, okay, that's where my needle needs to go in, about right there, to keep the angles similar. But that's not mandatory, because every leaf in nature is different. So, and that's how simple the leaves are. All right, so I think next what we'll do are the stems and the berries. So for the cherries, I like to draw the stem on a curve, but you could do it straight if you want. This is just free form. If you use a pen like a Pilot friction pen, this line will disappear when you press it, so it doesn't have to be exact. Now this cherry, it's the same as the leaf where you want to use a color that shows up against it. So since this is a black fabric, I'm using the lighter color. I'm whip stitching around the edge of the cherry just like the body of the bird and the tail of the bird. So I'll finish stitching this up. Once the cherry is whip stitched in place, then you'll switch to a dark thread so that it will show up against this background toweling fabric. And we're going to top each cherry with a couple little tiny leaves, which are made by doing a lazy daisy stitch. So you bring your thread up right at the base, right where the stem meets it. Take the needle down in that same hole, and then we're going to go over about 1/4 of an inch at an angle from the stem. The thread goes under the needle, and it forms a little loop. Then if you pull it really tight, that loop will close up, so you don't want to pull it too tight. And then just take the needle down on the other side of the loop to tack it in place. There's one, and then we're going to do one more going the other direction. So again, the thread comes up right at the center, right where the stem meets. The needle goes back down in that same hole at an angle this other way, about 1/4 of an inch. Put the thread under the needle, pull, and tack it in place. Now I'm going to bring my needle up right between those two lazy daisy stitches because I'm going to stem stitch the stem. So same exact way we did the center of the leaf before, we're going to do that going up the stem. So since this isn't as thick, I'm going to take smaller stitches. One thing I would say, if you're stitching on a curve like this is, I'm always going to carry the thread on the outside of the curve. And if you use a pilot friction pin that's going to disappear, then you don't have to be too worried about getting your stitches exactly over the line. So there's one of the stems, and the cherry's finished, so you can see how fun that looks. The final stitch I want to go over is the herringbone stitch, and that is the stitch used on the stems. So since the stems are black, we're going to use the light colored thread, and you can look at the directions to see where to start and kind of how to work it, although I am left-handed, so hopefully these will make sense to you. So the nice thing about stitching over that, besides holding it in place, I think it really gives it kind of a neat barky texture, and that's what reminded me of birch trees, and that's why I called it Birch Lane. We're going to start at one end of the stem. Okay, now I'm going to really confuse you because I'm going to switch to my right hand. And we're going to go across the stem, come down at an angle, across the stem, and then bring the thread back, or the needle back up on the same side, heading back towards where you began. Then this is going to cross over and form a little X. So now we're going to go over across the other side of the stem and then bring your needle back up towards where you began, to the other side of the stem. And each time we're going to move down the stem a little bit. They don't have to be perfect unless you have a type A personality, and it's going to really bother you if they're not. So you can make them really close together for a really tight look, or you can make them spaced out, or you can have kind of a variety if you want. Totally up to you. And that's how simple the herringbone is. But it really looks kind of cool, right? I like that. So I cannot wait to see your finished stitcheries. I hope you enjoy stitching this up and that will grace your table. It's kind of a fun one for fall and winter, and you can use it pretty much year round. So thanks so much. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you post any pictures of your stitchery on social media, I would love to see them. So please tag me, Kathy Schmitz. I'm on Instagram at Schmitz Stitches, and I'm on Facebook too, Kathy Schmitz. So thank you so much. Take care.